In May of 326 BC, the army of Alexander the Great stood upon the banks of the river Hydaspes in modern-day Punjab, Pakistan. Across the river lay the army of King Porus, one of the many Rajas of the western Indian region. The men in Alexander's service were particularly nervous when they saw what was beyond the bank. The Macedonians had been campaigning for nearly a decade up to this point, meeting and battling with before unknown peoples of various cultures and tactics wherever they went. What made this instance so different compared to the rest of the campaign? Well, for the first time in the Western world, we were introduced to the concept that would become a defining trait for many of antiquity's most famous battles, war elephants. Admittedly, the Battle of the Hydaspes is only the first confirmed case of elephants playing a role against Alexander. The former king Darius III of the Achaemenid Persian Empire had allegedly brought some to the famous Battle of Gaugamela 5 years earlier, but whether they actually participated in the battle is currently up in the air. Despite the Macedonians' abilities to counteract the elephants by causing them to stampede among Porus's own men, the power of the elephant had clearly impressed Alexander and his officers. In the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death in 321 BC, the fragmentation of his vast empire was caused by infighting among his generals, the so-called Diadochoi, which is literally translated as the successors. In 301, Antigonus I Monopothalamus, who dominated Asia Minor, lined up against a coalition of Lysimachus, the ruler of Thrace, Cassander, and Seleucus I Nicator, ruler of most of Alexander's eastern territories, at Ipsus in modern-day Turkey. While both sides made sure to bring elephants, it was the political haggling of Seleucus that may have sealed victory against Antigonus, where Seleucus bargained with the founder of the newly established Indian Mauryan Empire, Chandragupta, to be given several hundred war elephants in exchange for a political marriage and a transfer of most of Alexander's Indian territories. Diodorus Siculus points to Seleucus and his reserve of 480 elephants dwarfing the relatively paltry 75 the Antigonids brought as the main reason for Antigonus's defeat in the battle. After the cessation of the wars of the Diadochoi, a so-called elephants' arms race was taking place across the Mediterranean world. Almost every major political player was attempting to either capture more elephants or at the very least co-opt them into their army. Perhaps the most famous users of war elephants were the armies of the city-state Carthage in her numerous conflicts with the Roman Republic. While the Roman legionaries had faced elephants before during the invasions of King Pyrrhus of Epirus around 278, they were shown the devastating effects during the First Punic War, where in 255 the Spartan mercenary general Xanthippus successfully defeated and scattered the opposing Roman forces via deployment of a North African elephant unit. The most famous mountain cross in history was made particularly impressive by the near-absurd action of Hannibal Barca bringing a coalition of elephants all the way down the Alps in 218. Admittedly, nearly all of them perished in the crossing. Following Scipio Africanus' extremely effective counter-maneuvering around the elephants at the Battle of Zama in 202, the Romans began to implement them into their own forces, but the use of elephants began to play less of a role over the following century. Antiochus III, the so-called Great, quote-unquote, had likely done more harm than good in implementing elephants at the Battle of Magnesia and Thermopylae in the 190s. The last time we see elephants play a large role was during the civil wars of the late Roman Republic, at the Battle of Thapsus in 46 BC, where Julius Caesar crushed the remaining pro-Senate forces in modern-day Tunisia. With the average male Asian elephant standing at approximately 9 feet and weighing just over 5 tons, it may be easy to imagine elephants in combat as something akin to Elephants in Lord of the Rings. But they were not walking battle tanks. Instead, elephants had two main purposes: to counteract the ability of cavalry and shock and terrorize the enemy troops. The deterrence of enemy cavalry was a huge benefit in the employment of elephants. Horses are absolutely terrified of the immense size and scent of the beasts, and Antiochus I Soter put this into a great effect against the 40,000-strong Gallic coalition cavalry force that had broken into Asia Minor, by using his Indian elephants to scare the horses of the horsemen. The use of elephants as shock troops was just as devastating psychologically as it was physically. In the Battle of Bagradas in 255 BC during the First Punic War, Xanthippus managed to crash these elephants into the terrified Roman legionaries after scattering the cavalry. Polybius recounts, quote, "The first ranks of those who were stationed opposite the elephants pushed back when they encountered them, and trodden underfoot by the strength of the animals, fell in heaps in the melee. Henceforth, the Romans were in sore straits on all sides. The greater number were trampled to death by the vast weight of the elephants, while the remainder were shot down by the numerous cavalry in their ranks as they stood." In addition to the driver, called a mahout, there were often towers that contained additional archers on the back of the elephant to keep potential slayers at bay. This shock and terror was a powerful tool in psyching out the enemy opponents and breaking up formations. Yet it was a double-edged sword, as in many instances a wounded and enraged elephant would cause as much damage to one's own side as they would to the enemy's, as so famously demonstrated in the Battle of the Hydaspes. The mahouts generally were given special chisels that would sever the base of the spinal column from the skull if the elephant became out of control, but if the mahouts were killed, nothing could have controlled the beasts. By the Battle of Zama, the Romans had learned how to effectively exploit the weaknesses of the elephants. They trained their cavalry to ride up and pelt the extremely pain-sensitive creatures with darts and javelins, and formed columns that created gaps that allowed the elephant to simply pass through without harm. Some of the more infamous counterattacks were the alleged use of pigs covered in tar and pitch, which would be then set ablaze and sent screaming towards the enemy elephant units. The use of war elephants left an imprint of the exoticism of the East on the minds of the people of classical antiquity. As early as Alexander the Great, we see commemorative medallions and coinage bearing the image of the war elephant to celebrate his conquests of India. The imitation to Alexander that followed through the use of elephant imagery became a common theme in the Hellenistic and Roman age. The Diadochoi had minted many coinages with the elephant imprinted upon it. A young Pompey Magnus had yet embarrassed himself by attempting to use 4 elephants to pull his chariot into the city of Rome during his triumph, only to discover that the elephants in fact were too large to fit through the gates. Even Caesar himself struck a mint after the Battle of Thapsus to commemorate the event with an elephant emblem on the back. The characterization of elephants was one of majesty and intelligence to many of the scholars and authors of the time of classical antiquity. Pliny the Elder in his Natural History comments about the elephant's splendid nature, quote, "The elephant is the largest of them all, and in intelligence approaches the nearest to man. It understands the language of its country, it obeys commands, and it remembers all the duties which it has been taught. It is sensible alike of the pleasures of love and glory, and, to a degree that is rare among men even, possesses notions of honesty, prudence, and equity. It has a religious respect also for the stars, and a veneration for the sun and the moon." While clearly a case of blatant anthropomorphization that would make a behavioral biologist blush, the nature of empathy expressed towards elephants is rather surprising, especially from a recorded incident involving the normally blood sport-loving Roman mob. Pompey Magnus embarrassed himself yet again in an attempted display of bravado by bringing captured elephants that were to be fought in a beast hunt in the arena. Cicero writes in his letter of the indignation of the crowd, quote, "The last day was that of the elephants, on which there was a great deal of astonishment on the part of the vulgar crowd, but no pleasure whatever. Nay, there was even a certain feeling of compassion aroused by it, and a kind of belief that created that the animal has something in common with mankind." Pliny, while writing a century after the event, also gives a more impassioned picture of the scene, quote, "When, however, the elephants in the exhibition were given by Pompeius had lost all hopes of escaping, and with a kind of lamentation bewailed their unhappy fate, so greatly were the people affected by the scene that, forgetting the general altogether, and the munificence which had been at such pains to do them honor, the whole assembly rose up in tears and showered curses on Pompeius, of which he soon afterwards became the victim." Despite the perceived empathy towards the creatures, the demand for elephants changed from that of war to that of the booming ivory business, which was so destructive on the North African elephant population that it essentially rendered the subspecies extinct or extirpated in the 1st century AD. The splendor and myth of elephants soon faded from the public viewpoint as the centuries rolled on, and by the fall of the Western Empire, elephants were hardly ever seen in Europe again, leading towards some bizarre medieval interpretations in the later centuries, while their use in warfare in the Far East would continue up to the 20th century.